Our speaker is Mr. Brian Johnson, and this is him, if you recognize his photograph. I first ran into him when I opened a package that came to the museum, and here was a book by an author that I didn't know. I didn't know the book. Well, this is pretty cool. And a little letter said, here's a book. I hope that your museum will enjoy it, and thank you very much. So this is the book, Only an Observer. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool. So yeah, this is great. We love stuff like this. Local stories about local people, talking BC here. And the author is local. So I happened to email him a few months later, and I said, well, would you ever consider doing a speaker night? And foolishly he accepted. So he's going to tell you the story, and I'll turn it over to Brian, and you're in good hands.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you for having me. This is actually not my story, it's my grandfather's story, who served in World War I. About 3 years on the Western Front. Let's see here. For the first couple of years, he built railroads to the front, and the last year of the war, he flew 6 months over the front in the last 6 months of the war as an observer in doing for artillery spotting and whatnot. The original manuscript he actually wrote from memory in the 1960s, about 40 years after the events. And various of us family tried to do something with it, and I guess finally in retirement, probably about the same age as he was when he did it in the 60s, I thought for the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War that we should do something with this, and so I had it self-published and to preserve his story. And the reason for the title of the book is that, of course, we read lots about the fighter aces of World War I, but we don't read much about other airmen who were just as brave and faced equal or even harsher dangers. And so this is in his words. He was talking to a young friend that he had known for a number of years, and the fellow found out that he had served in the Royal Air Force and the Royal Flying Corps. And he asked me if I'd been a pilot. I had no option but to tell him I'd been an observer. My friend could not too obviously hide his disappointment and blurted out, "Only an observer." I am under the impression that through the years of our acquaintance, he had to some degree admired me. I felt distressed that I should have failed him so, but there it was. From my memory of those days within the confines of the squadron and the artillery batteries and those many others we served, we observers were not looked upon as lesser people. World War I was from August 1914 to November 1918, saw the combatants as the Central Powers, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Germany, and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. On the other side were the British, French, and Russians, and in 1917, the United States. Of course, in the British Empire, there were Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South African, Indians, and all the 30-plus nations that made up the British Empire at that time. Because of modern weaponry like artillery and machine guns, outside of the first few months at the beginning and the end of the war, it was a static war where and men lived in trenches in the mud, something like 4 million men on both sides. And the trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. And during most of those 4 years, the trenches didn't move much more than a few miles in each direction, and literally millions of men died. And although it was a global war, about 65% of the British Empire peoples fought on the Western Front. This map, this line here, the solid line, is the 500-mile-odd trench line, where most of the war was, after the first few months, became a static war for 4 years. At the end of 1917, the Russians had exited themselves from the war, so the Germans weren't fighting on two fronts. And on the Allied side, the Americans had entered the war. So the Germans put on a last push between March and July of 1918 and moved the line this way for a few months. But their offensive soon ran out, and the Allies in the from July to November, pushed the Germans back to this line, and the armistice was signed in 1918, November the 11th, and the war ended. We'll come back to this, but my grandfather's squadron that he flew in, number 2 squadron, was based here throughout the war. This is Vimy near there, that's well known to Canadians. The Somme front was in that area. There were 11 million military people died during the war, as well as 7 million civilians, and there were something like 21 million soldiers wounded. Canada contributed, or had 620,000 enlists, 424 went overseas, 1,000 went overseas, 61,000 killed and 172,000 wounded. So with a casualty rate of 55%, so your chances of coming back unharmed were not good. There were development of new technologies like the airplane and tanks, but there were also refinements of old technologies like railroads that actually made, I guess, the war possible because of the ability to get men and equipment in that kind of volume to the front. Railroads were a 80-year-old technology by the time the First World War broke out, and by that time there were 180,000 miles of railroads in Europe. They had invented in the 1830s, but had been used not only for passengers and cargo, but for military purposes from the beginning. In particular, the U.S. Civil War, the Boer War, many European and Asian conflicts, and even in the Riel Rebellion, troops were taken partway across. The CBR wasn't far enough yet. They had to march the rest of the way. It is estimated that in 1914, a division of 12,000 men required 140 tons of materials. By 1918, they would require 1,000 tons of materials a day, and that required 2 50-wagon trains to supply just 12,000 men. But there were 4 million men on both sides. So new railroads had to be constructed. What they did was construct standard gauge railroads, the similar ones that we have here today, to within 20 miles or so of the front, out of artillery range. And then they would construct narrow gauge, 2-foot wide railroads built like kids' electric trains. The ties and the rails were already assembled, and men could just carry them and join the sections together. And these were used to span the torn up ground in those 20 miles each side of the front. And then they had small engines, horses, or soldiers pushing the wagons to get them to the front. It also saw the development of specialized trains for ambulances, armored trains, artillery. This is a picture of a small gauge train in the foreground with a standard gauge train in the background. Oftentimes they would use petrol engines rather than steam engines because the smoke from the steam engines attracted artillery fire from the enemy. This is the type of ground those narrow gauge railroads had to go through. And this was typical of the heavy artillery. This is a 14-inch naval gun that was mounted on a railroad car to those things could fire like 20 miles. And of course, and this is where we'll come around, the story will come around, to be able to know where your shells were landed. This is where observation planes came into effect. And my grandfather was involved in both building track for these and then later in the war to flying in airplanes observing where their shells landed. Canadian soldiers were important in the British section because we had a lot of railroad building experience in the years leading up to the war. And the first contingent of that's the CORCC is the Canadian Overseas Railroad Construction Corps. It was formed in February 1915, and 507 men, mostly Canadian Pacific Railway employees, went to England by the end of 1915. Second contingent of 142 were formed in September of 1915, of which Charles, my grandfather, was part of, and went to England in January 1916. Eventually, Canadians made up about 40% of the railroad battalions building railroads in the British sector. The military use of airplanes was in its infancy when World War I started. It was only 11 years after the Wright brothers and 5 years after Blériot, the Frenchman, crossed the English Channel. Planes were flimsy wooden fabric, and there's obviously, you see some examples in the museum here. But World War I saw the rapid development. It was aircraft technology on steroids. And the British alone developed 30 different types of aircraft in those 4 years. The roles included artillery observation, aerial bombardment, ground attack, photo reconnaissance, covert operations, and home defense. And then scouts or fighters were developed to protect their own airplanes doing that kind of work and the enemy's airplanes, to prevent the enemy's airplanes from doing that kind of work. Due to the static nature of the war, though, the primary role of airplanes was to support the soldiers on the ground. There's just an aerial view of the trench called the Hindenburg Line, which was actually a secondary line in the German defensive system. Training of air crews was minimal by today's standard, and the rapidly changing technology resulted in many structural and mechanical problems, which actually caused more casualties than enemy action. The wooden fabric airplanes had a minimum of instruments. They opened cockpits. They subjected the crews to all weather, engine noise, leaking oils and fumes. And the engines did leak a lot of what was called castor oil that they used, which caused a lot of stomach problems for airmen. There were no safety features. There was no oxygen, and by 1918, planes were exceeding 20,000 feet in elevation. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks, parachutes, or even safety belts for that matter. And life expectancy of air crews was measured in weeks. The Royal Flying Corps was started only 2 years before the war started, and by 1914 there were only 2,100 personnel and about 100 airplanes. There were 5 squadrons, but number 1 squadron was a balloon squadron, and number 2 and 5 had airplanes. By 1918, there were 114,000 personnel in the Air Force, over 4,000 planes and 150 squadrons. Interestingly enough, about 40% of the Royal Air Force by the end of the war were Canadians. In fact, there was discussions of forming the Royal Canadian Air Force, but it was felt that it would have been too disruptive to separate them from the Royal Air Force. And casualties included 9,000 killed and 7,000 wounded from enemy action, but 8,000 plus killed, and I don't know how many wounded, just from flying accidents and structural and mechanical failures. In August of 1914, number 2, 3, and 4 squadrons consisting of 80 airplanes flew to France, followed by number 5 squadron. Number 2 squadron, Charles's squadron in 1918, was termed the Corps Squadron, and they supported the Army through reconnaissance, photography and artillery spotting and bombing. The artillery spotting involved a complicated system of visual ground signals, especially at the First World War, the start of the First World War. The airplanes, any kind of transmitters, wireless, the airplanes couldn't put them in the air. So at the start of the war, it was all by ground signals and message bags that were dropped to the artillery to tell them to change their aim. But by later in the war, the wireless transmitters were small enough that they could carry on the airplanes, but they didn't have receivers. Receivers were too big, so the airplanes carried transmitters and could Morse code to the battery that they were working with, but the Morse battery had to use ground signals to tell the airplane what it was up to. Also with aerial photography, just in those 4 years it was developed from basically nothing to mosaic maps of the whole front, and using photoplate, big bulky photoplate cameras, shooting through holes in the floor of the airplane or hung out over the side of the airplane. A typical squadron, once again, it was an army at that time, consisted of 200 personnel, and it had an army major in charge of it. It was a basic unit in the RAF. It was divided into different flights, which did different things, had 8 or so pilots and corresponding observers in each flight, and probably about 24 airplanes. Number 2 squadron actually is reported to be the oldest Air Force squadron in the world. It still exists in Scotland, and they fly Tornadoes. Their motto is Guardian of the Army, and I was able to contact them, or actually one of their historians, and I think they still fly an Army officer in the second seat of the airplane, like they did in the first. Number 2 squadron was not a fighter squadron, but it did have one ace. So an ace was somebody who shot down 5 or more enemy planes. And he was an observer named Arthur Hammond, and MC means he had also some distinguished flying crosses, but he was awarded a military cross in February of 1918, and I'll tell you that story in a minute. It also had 2 Victoria Crosses, one to a Rhodes Moorhouse and another to a Canadian named Alan McLeod. Moorhouse won his award in bombing a rail junction in 1915 and was actually the first airman to be awarded a Victoria Cross. And that is the plane that Moorhouse flew in, even though it was a 2-seater plane for that particular run because it was far into enemy territory. He went by himself so that the airplane could carry some bombs. The McLeod and Hammond story is a remarkable story. They were flying this Armstrong Whitworth bomber called the Big Ack, which was the standard plane of No. 2 Squadron in 1918. It had a climbing rate of between 50 and 70 miles an hour, and flat out it could maybe do 90 miles an hour. It was outdated by 1918, but it was a good stable platform, and it was armed with a forward-firing figure gun through the propeller, synchronized, and a scarf or a movable Lewis gun in the rear cockpit. And that was known as the Big Ack. So they were on a bombing mission, McLeod and Hammond, and they saw a Fokker triplane, which was the favorite plane of the Red Barons, and they were coming out of a cloud. They saw it. McLeod maneuvered the airplane close, and Hammond shot it down. But the clouds cleared, and there were suddenly 8 Fokker. They all came in for the kill. Hammond was able to shoot a second one down, but Fokker wounded both, and the fuel tank of the Big Ack was located between the pilot's cockpit and the observer's cockpit, and it started on fire. And but a third one approached, and Hammond got a good shot at it. It wasn't recorded as that he shot it down, but it went away. Then McLeod had to climb out on the wing and side-slip the plane so that the flames blew away from the cockpit. And also the bottom of the airplane fell out, so Hammond had to climb onto the side of the cockpit. Another Fokker came in thinking it was over, and Hammond shot it down by sitting on the edge of the cockpit. Then finally another Fokker came in and disabled his gun, and they crash-landed in no man's land, and this was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so between the trenches. And McLeod pulled Hammond out of the plane. He was unconscious, and dragged him to a shell hole. And they had to wait there until it got dark and until they were rescued by South African troops. Hammond actually lost his leg. He did actually immigrated to Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in World War II, and actually passed away here in 1959. McLeod recovered enough to receive his Victoria Cross from the King. Returned to Winnipeg, where he was from, and died of the Spanish flu, which actually killed more people in 1918 and 19 than the First World War. And the Spanish flu seemed to hit young people, and mostly returning soldiers, actually. And he died 5 days before the war, and he was only 19. Even the German who shot him down didn't survive the war. So life in the air could be terrifying and short, regardless of which side you are. And although the airplanes varied in performance, say from the Big Ack that might average 70 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour in flat out, even the fast fighters would only be up to about 120 miles an hour. And as my grandfather said in his story, the slower planes couldn't run away. So they had to fight it out. It was the faster plane could bug out if it got too hot for them. At the start of the war, pilots were showing up with 10 hours flying experience, and even by the end of the war, they were getting only 30 to 50 hours flying experience. And you can imagine, you can see in your museum here, and the one you're constructing, that fabric and wood airplanes mixed with dope paint and gasoline are pretty flammable items. And even though there were parachutes developed probably by, well, there were parachutes actually earlier in the war for observers in observation balloons, but they were too bulky to carry in airplanes. But by 1917, there were workable parachutes, and the Germans actually used parachutes in 1918, whereas the British didn't, because they thought it would impair the fighting spirit of the airmen. The term ace was first coined by French newspapers in 1915, and part of it was knights of the air jousting in the clear open air contrasted to the poor soldiers dying in the mud of the trenches. The French and Germans thought it would be good for public morale to publicize and I guess boast about their aces. The British command, however, took the view that it would be detrimental to other brave crew to publicize just the fighter people. However, they became famous in the British press, and the pilots and air crew of other types of airplanes were largely ignored. As I mentioned before, more planes were lost to mechanical structural failure and accidents and ground fire than actual aerial combat. Interestingly enough, and that surprised me, a few years ago I was in the War Museum in London, and they had just redone the World War I section of it, and it showed pictures of the Red Baron, and it showed an Australian machine gunner, not Roy Brown, the Canadian Sopwith Camel pilot that was reported to have shot him down, and recent analysis has showed that the Red Baron was actually shot down by a machine gun bullet from the ground, not from in aerial combat. It is also noted that the majority of the aces did not survive the war. So that's sort of my introduction to my grandfather's story. His story mostly is about the flying. I understand we have a break partway through. I'll maybe go through his railroad time, and then we'll leave the flying time to the last part. He was born in Sweden in 1891. His uncle had come out to work on the building of the CPR through the Rogers Pass, and his father had immigrated in 1891 to join his brother and work on the CPR. I put the math together. He must have been conceived. And my great-grandfather must have hadn't seen him probably until my great-grandmother and the family came out in 1893 to Hague, which is across the river from Hope, because the Canadian Pacific Railroad goes down that side, and it wasn't connected to Hope until 1914 when the Kettle Valley Railroad was built and a bridge was built across the Fraser River. So, and they homesteaded there, and right on the junction of where Highway 1 and the Highway 7 from Agassiz comes. And I remember as a kid, the old homestead was finally, the last 5 acres of the homestead was expropriated, and the old house torn down to build Highway 7. This is Hope Station in 1896. And the Johnson family in front of a temporary house before they were able to buy an abandoned hotel in Yale, abandoned from the gold rush in Yale, and I guess they took it apart and floated it down the Fraser River and then reconstructed it on the farm at the junction of those roads. Charles joined the CPR himself at 15 years old, working on track maintenance. And then between 1911 and 14, he went to college in Summerland, BC, and to obtain a McMaster's University matriculation certificate. And he paid for that by working part-time for the railroad, and then was working in 1915 in the Rogers Pass and joined the Canadian Expedition Force in Field, BC in September 1915. This is actually a certificate that was issued by the Canadian Pacific Railroad to men who gave up their job to serve for king and country in the First World War. He landed in England in January 1916, and he built railroad sidings at Newcastle on Tyne. Interesting enough, to the Armstrong Whitworth factory that he would fly in their airplane in 1918. They were paid $1.10 a day. He then went to France in March 1916 and got another $1 a day. That's called working pay. He initially worked near the Ypres front on building for those large railroad guns. They had to build, the guns only could traverse a few degrees each way on the railroad carriage, so they had to build curving railroads so that the gun could shoot at a wider arch. And they used sand, and they dug actually sand from the beach in Dunkirk, where the armies evacuated in the Second World War, to build bases for these guns. But they would get Sundays off, and he would, now this is a boy from the backwoods of British Columbia, a little farm boy going to sophisticated European cities, and this is when he saw the Dunkirk mayor. I saw a gentleman standing in a characteristic posture behind a scanted, non-hidden convenience for men, which left one's legs and knees and shoulders of a tall man exposed. He was deeply doffing, as the circumstances permitted, with his free hand, his tall silk hat at the ladies and gentlemen passing by. I was to learn that to the French, there was nothing the least embarrassing in such a situation. And he also watched the meat. At one of these luncheons, I was to watch the uninhibited manner of the French and their down-to-earth lack of unnecessary formality and total absence of anything suggesting stiffness. I feel the French can go further at being informal without any semblance of vulgarity than we can, but then they suffer less from anything suggested of an inferiority complex. He knew how to write. In May of 1916, he participated in one of the first narrow gauge railroad construction in the Ypres area of the British front. And he was intrigued by the airplanes and made an application to the Royal Flying Corps, but he failed because he had never driven a car, had no knowledge of wireless, and was too heavy. Early in 1917, he built standard gauge railways across the Somme battlefields, and but by 1917 there were 13 Canadian railway battalions and a shortage of officers, and he was promoted to be a lieutenant in the 5th Battalion of the Canadian Railroad Troops. And this is his commissioning certificate in the Canadian militia as a lieutenant. In 1917, he returned to the environs of Dunkirk and with some Vancouver officers. And we were looking at your SPAD, First World War airplane out here, and it has Belle Irving on it. And Doug was telling me that there were actually 6 Bell Irving boys in the First World War, of which one of them was killed, but 5 of them. So we don't know, so I'm going to do some research to find out what. But I guess they were pretty charming guys, and when Charles took them to Astamine, or a beer parlor that he knew from the year before, and it was owned by a family with 3 daughters, who happened to be one of my aunts was named after one of the daughters. So that might be another story. He finally was able to talk to the girl he had been trying to teach English to, and she asked her how she was doing, and she says, "I haven't learned very much, but I've learned what pulsy legs mean." In the spring of 1917, they built a standard gauge railroad from Dunkirk through Belgium to Prozing. And as a farm boy, he liked to go and during off times work on the farm, and said he surprised people. It was, I guess, only and these are Belgian farms, that only the Belgian ladies milk cows, and he surprised them that he knew how to milk a cow. Late in 1917, he again applied for the Royal Flying Corps and went for an interview, and there were no questions about cars and wireless, but the interviewer was pleased or liked to know that he had paddled a dugout canoe on the Fraser River, and that he had never shot a grizzly bear, or any bear for that matter. And so he was recommended for the Air Force. He learned later that the interviewer was McGill, a psychology professor, and they tried to encourage people to boast. And if you boasted, you didn't get accepted, because in the military, if you were going into the Air Force and being an observation person, they wanted straight intelligence. They didn't want any fiction. So then in October, he went to England to train as an observer. At this time of the war, most of the observers were experienced soldiers who had worked at the front. And the pilots, so they were tended to be older. They still wore their army uniforms and displaying their regimental badges, and were able to wear an observer's insignia on their tunic. The pilots tended to be younger, and most of them did not have any military experience. So then there were a lot of, I guess the training schools were filled, so it wasn't until May of 1918 that he had finished his training. And this is his observer wing and his 5th Battalion Railroad troop lapel buttons. So he did training in photos and artillery observation at Worthy Down Airport in England, training wireless and machine guns at Hersey Camp, where he met a woman, Army Auxiliary Corps girl from Cornwall, Sadie Penhall, who he was later married. And with 7.5 hours flying experience, he was shipped off to France. That's just my grandmother and the middle one. So I think that's probably a good place, Doug, if you want to break, and the rest of it's about his flying experience. Okay, so on May the 8th, he was shipped to France. This is 1918, and he was one of 3 replacements to the squadron, the number 2 squadron. And so the major said, "Oh, we'll find something. You can be a spare in A flight. We'll find something for you to do. It's the Canadian flight." And so on May the 9th, he did his first, with 7.5 hours flying experience before he got there. He actually did 7 hours and 40 minutes on his first day. And he said that in his whole other 400 hours of flying, he never did that much flying in one day, but the squadron had a lot of casualties, and I guess they had the job to do. And this pilot, Poe was from Toronto, told them just to keep a sharp lookout for enemy aircraft, and he said it left, the day left him bewildered and half deaf. And he said it was the only time in his 6 months with the squadron that he drank too much at the mess in the squadron. He drank too much some other places, but not at the mess, and it was because he was just so bewildered. But the next day, Poe taking off hit a tree and was killed, and he wondered if that almost 8 hours of flying the day before had made him tired and not as alert. And also, within 3 weeks in A flight, he became the senior observer, and not because he was particularly talented, just because he had survived for 3 weeks. Oops, wrong way. And he got another commission as a lieutenant, but now in the Royal Air Force. So this was, and this came a month after flying. He was officially transferred to the Royal Air Force from the Canadian Militia. Although, up in the far corner there, it says temporarily. So A flight's duties were mainly artillery observation, correction of the daily allotment of shelling from division field guns and howitzers. C flight was contact, more direct cooperation with the soldiers on the ground, and what they would do if they had an attack going in. The soldiers on the ground had some kind of air horns, and they would blow their air horns so that the planes flying over could see how far these guys had advanced. And the airplane flew back over their own lines to some headquarter area and dropped message bags to say, giving a map coordinate how far the soldiers had advanced. But these guys had to fly very low in order to hear that, and of course ground fire. And that was, they had done an estimate that of 10 planes lost to enemy action, 2 would be to enemy aircraft, 2 to actual anti-aircraft fire, and 6 to small arms fire from the ground. So just soldiers with rifles shooting at these planes flying at 70 miles an hour over them. And so 60% of them. So as Charles said, there must have been a lot of soldiers were aces too, not just the fellows who were flying. So air ops was artillery observation. The planes were equipped with a wireless. Both the pilot and observer could do Morse code, and both did shoots. They might even do 2 shoots at the same time. And they sort of flew a figure 8. They were high enough up so that if the gun shot 10 miles or something, they could see the flash. They would turn so they could see the flash of the gun that was shooting. Then they had about 45 seconds as the shell flew to see the blast where it landed. And then with mapping coordinates, they could Morse code back and tell you've overshot by 100 yards. And then the artillery fellows would correct their aim, or you've shot left or right of the target. And so a typical shoot before they took off, they would wireless the battery that they were doing the shoot with that day. They would take off, they would have to reel out about a 200-foot wire aerial that had a lead weight on the end for their transmitter. They would fly over the battery. The battery would put out a ground signal that they were ready. Now, of course, they want that out for the shortest period of time because there were German observation planes flying the other way, and the batteries were usually camouflaged, so if they saw the signal out, then the German observation plane would know with their gun what they could do. They carried a couple of 25-pound bombs, and they would, after they sure they had crossed their own trenches, they just randomly dropped these bombs on the other guy's trenches. And he said when he was taking up new pilots, they had, because anti-aircraft fire would happen near the front, they had to really make sure that the new pilot didn't drop his bombs too soon, so he was dropping it on their own troops. They would, in that 45 seconds, they would scan the air looking for enemy airplanes, and then, as I said, go through the thing. Interesting enough, because it was a static war, and this is why when I previously mentioned about the trains, the supplies went from 140 tons a day to 1,000 tons a day for 12,000 men. Is because it was a static war, they actually had allotments a day. So a 12-inch gun would fire 20 shells a day. A 6-inch gun would fire 250 shells. Even if they weren't attacking, they would, from aerial photographs, they would pick out where there were strategic either enemy batteries or road junctions and stuff. And then that would be the assignment. And the work of these guys, the observer squadrons or corps squadrons, was to fly over the front every day. So it was like going to work, not being shot at. And an average flight would be 2.5 hours, and they would likely do 2 flights a day. And then at this stage of the war, because the thing to remember, in the First World War, everything was being invented. And basically, they were able to invent just about every strategic thing that air forces have done since the First World War. And I'll get into that in a bit. So actually the commander, when Charles joined, was an Australian major named Snow. And in Charles's words, he stood head and shoulders above the rest of us in spite of his small stature, in his ability to perform all the tasks of the squadron. But in August, they were instructed to try to destroy a railroad junction. Major Snow, who was a pilot, took the Bristol Fighter, which was a next generation 2-seater, which was actually as good as maybe the SE-5 out there or the German Fokker D7, even though it was a 2-seater, and was used well into the 20s by the RAF. And but at 17,000 feet, he felt ill, and he returned, and he had a heart condition and died 2 weeks later. And this was partly because, of course, no oxygen at 17,000 feet, and then a Major Ross Hume took over. And this is a Bristol Fighter, so they're starting to really look like, when compared to that first airplane we saw, these are really starting to look like airplanes. As a senior observer that he got to be in 3 weeks, there was no extra status or rank, and he did the same work as the other observers. But the big difference was that he had to train new pilots. So these pilots coming with 30 hours experience at this time, he had to and had never been at the war, he had to take them up. And during his 400 plus hours over the front, he flew with 25 different pilots, and most of them brand new pilots. So it is a wonder that I'm here. Usually there would be 2 or 3 regular patrol. There'd be an orientation flight and then 2 or 3 regular patrol flights before he would get the the next new pilot. This is just a story of one pilot he flew with, which he termed the suicide pilot. And he was involved in 3 incidents with him. The first was Papa was relatively new at this time, and they came in and they landed and they didn't seem to stop. They kept going, and he thought this was quite exciting because of his inexperience. But they went, and then they turned 90 degrees and went into a hangar and crashed head on with 2 airplanes. And they were being bawled out, or the pilot was being bawled out, but he was claiming that his throttle had stuck. But there was a turn-off switch that he had forgotten that there was even a turn-off switch. So the next day they went up, and maybe the pilot was feeling a little remorse, and it wasn't the job of course planes to attack observation balloons, but because they were usually well protected by anti-aircraft guns as well as fighter planes, and they got attacked. So they shot at this balloon, but it was too far away, and they were attacked by 3 Fokker triplanes. But they were low enough that the triplanes couldn't get underneath them, but Papa could still shoot his machine gun, which trails back and forth. But he had a hard time turning it off when he switched from this side to this side, and he kept shooting holes in the tail, in the rudder of his airplane, which they were instructed not to do, and he would get into a lot of trouble. However, when they landed, there were far more holes in the back of the airplane, thanks to the 3 fighter triplanes, than him and his holes that he had put in his own plane were ignored. Then a week later, with that same pilot, they were up, and just somebody's bullet from the ground hit their radiator, and they had to make a forced landing. So those were 3 flights. The fellow was then crashed again into the hangar, another hangar, but with another observer, and destroyed one of the only 2 Bristol fighters that they had, and as a result of that, their other Bristol fighter was taken away from them, so they were left with Big Axe. And so the guy got transferred to another squadron, and they heard he crashed 2 planes there, then they transferred him to a fighter squadron, so then he'd be on his own. So if he killed him, he'd only kill himself.
So he'd actually be an ace.
And this is the Fokker D1 triplane, which was probably a preeminent German fighter in 1917 and early 1918, and was what the Red Baron wrote his name in. A dawn patrol was a patrol where they would take off actually before the sun came up to look for surprise advances of the enemy. And the dangers of that were the morning mist, and also if an advance was coming, the enemy would likely have fighter planes ahead to shoot down observation planes so that they wouldn't report the advance. One of their crews, this wasn't Charles's, but they got lost in the mist, and they landed in a field, and it turned out the field was occupied by the enemy, and they started to get shot at, and the pilot had his hand on the throttle. He lost his little finger, but the pilot claimed that the bullet moved the throttle forward and allowed them to take off from the field. There was socializing with the battery officers was encouraged, because then they could go over technical details about their shoots together and also drink each other's whiskey. But it also allowed the squadron officers to have ground transportation to visit the local pubs on their way back, or the nurses and doctors at the CCS, means Casualty Clearing Station. And alcohol was plenty, and I guess and I just read this recently, that actually Canada had prohibition for part of the First World War, a couple of years of prohibition. We hear about the American prohibition in the 30s, but I guess we had prohibition too in that a few years in the First World War. And so these soldiers were coming from temperance homes in Canada, small towns, and being exposed. And actually, beer was supplied to the soldiers and scotch to the officers by the army. So this is one of 3 actual photos that Charles had from the First World War, and this is a picnic with, there shouldn't be a 7, it should be an and there, but with doctors and nurses of the casualty clearing station. That's Charles being fed by, I forget the nurse's name. And these are just some of his squadron mates. They actually lived in tents. And Charles is here in his house coat. He had just come back from or had been sleeping after a dawn patrol or something, and when the photo was taken, and came out in his house coat. But he said that he actually wore his house coat over his tunic and under his greatcoat when he was flying, so that if he got shot down and survived and went to a prison camp, he would have a nice warm house coat. As I mentioned, they were trying different things of. Sorry, am I in your way here? No. Experiments. In this particular experiment, rather than have an artillery barrage precede a soldier advance, each plane was, the observer wouldn't fly in it, and they'd only fill one of the 2 gas tanks, or petrol tanks, with fuel, and each plane would carry 16 25-pound bombs and in the squadron. And Charles, though, was in the only observation plane to call in anti-aircraft or anti-artillery fire, but they were flying low in the clouds, and he felt a burning through his feet, and then the engine sputtered, and the pilot passed a note back that he'd been hit. And Charles looked down, and the bottom of the cockpit was all covered in petrol. And he remembered that whenever you worked the Morse code, a spark went down this aerial, so he quickly disconnected it. And he could tell that the pilot was Morse coding back to base that he had been hit. And and Charles said he was prepared to climb out on the wing and help the pilot out, but the pilot seemed to be flying okay, and that he had done that once in some stunt, climbed out on the wing. And but when they got back, there's a reserve tank that actually, there was the one tank between the cockpits, and then there was a reserve tank that, on top of the wing, that flowed by gravity. So they got back to base, and when they found they got back to base, the bullet had actually spent, and it just had brushed his boot, gone through the gas tank, through his brand new cap that he had just paid so many shillings for in England, that was on top of the cap, two cushions, and hit the pilot in the arse. But they found the spent bullet in his puttees. So they were back up flying that afternoon. Another experiment was this night reconnaissance, where the plane was only, both the observer and the pilot would go up, but only one tank of petrol, and they carried 6 60-pound flares. They were to fly far over the front to particular junctions which they had picked out. They dropped the flares where the flare would last for about 10 minutes, and then they could observe troop movements or whatnot. The first crew that was assigned didn't return, and Charles and this Captain Bertel were assigned and actually did five of these night reconnaissance. Their most successful one was when they were at a party at the casualty clearing station again. Although he said it was 1918, the nurses went home and they were partying with the doctors. And this Dr. Lamb had not army scotch, but specially imported scotch from England, and they were enjoying Lamb's babies. And they got back at midnight and feeling no pain, and everything was shut down, and they hadn't been in, or nobody told them that because they'd been out partying, that the flight had been canceled because of weather. And so the Captain Bertel woke up the mechanics and bawled them out, got them to get an airplane out. He and Charles flew off, the weather cleared. They were able to do a very successful observation with their flares, and I even did a correction of some shelling that was going on. And actually were mentioned in Comic Cuts, and Comic Cuts was sort of a weekly newspaper of the RAF that told of different things that happened. So they thought that Lamb's babies were the necessary thing for success. With another young pilot named Newell, who was a 19-year-old and had 30 hours flying experience when he came. He and Charles were on their third flight when they'd observed one of their squadron planes being attacked by two Fokker D-7s, which was probably the best German fighter plane at the end of the war. And so they went to the aid, and Charles was able to fire at what he termed the Jerry, or the Fokker, underneath the other plane, and it dived away. The other Jerry swept across so close that he could see the pilot's face, the chubby face lad, he called him. Then that plane turned and fired, and he said he could have reached up and touched the bullets that went over Charles's head. Charles was able to do a short burst and lace the Fokker with bullets, and it just dived away. And then, just as he turned, he was met by a bath of oil in his face, and the engine stopped. But he said that this Newell was a natural pilot, and they were able to glide to a safe landing in a field. And and the other big act was able to make it home, although the pilot was wounded. But in the Second World War, when he saw pictures of Hermann Goering, it reminded him of that chubby-faced lad that he saw. And so I did a little research, and Goering took over. Richthofen was killed in, I don't know, February or March of 1918. And Hermann Goering took over from Richthofen, leading that group of squadrons that Richthofen. And during the last 6 months of the war, those squadrons were actually in 3 different bases, because the Germans were retreating. And but all those bases were within 100 miles of Charles's base. So it's very possible that it could. So there could have been a different result. The Germans may not have had Hitler's number 2 man, or the head of the Luftwaffe in World War II. But once again, they had a job to do, and even though they'd just been shot down, they had to go up without lunch. They caught a ride back to the base and had to go up and do a second flight and their shoot in the afternoon. But the bullet that shot them down in the engine turned out to be an Allied 303 bullet, and one of their own soldiers was helping out in the air battle and shot them down. So this was the Fokker D-7. Sorry, I went through that. Comic Cuts was, as I mentioned, was the official communique of the RAF. And it reported on not just the aces, in fact, it would just name one plane was shot down by Captain Smith, 2 planes shot. But it also reported on actions like Lamb's babies actions and whatnot. And so, and Charles was up again with Noel and noticed a terrific concentration of fire over the line, which could have been a precursor to a heavy German attack. And so there was a special call they could do which would give them all the batteries in the area and control over them. And I guess he did a record number of calls in 15 minutes that stopped the German guns from firing. So he was mentioned in Comic Cuts, but he was also mentioned in Dispatch, which was one of the first levels of metals that you get for this. Interestingly enough, during this thing, a Rumpler C-4, which was the equivalent German observation plane, was obviously directing the fire of the German guns and was flying back and forth. So they were passing each other, but their job was not to shoot each other down, it was to direct their own artillery fire, because there were more soldiers dying on the ground down there than the 4 men flying in the air. And this was a German Rumpler. So the incident was written up in Comic Cuts. Major Snow, who was a very stern Australian fellow, actually gave him a compliment and complimented on his skill and recommended him for the mention in Dispatch. But that afternoon, Major Snow wanted to go up on a photo and asked Charles to come with him. And the Major had trouble getting the engine started, and probably because Charles' chest was puffed up a bit by his being a bit of a hero in the morning, he, in a bantering way, suggested to the Major if he turned on the switch, the engine would start easier, which wasn't a good start. Then they went off and had Charles testing the gun, and the gun jammed, and it took a minute. He got a note passed back to him that it took him 1 minute and 40 seconds to clear the jam, which was not fast enough. Then they went over the front and they took some photos, and the Major jumped out when they got back, and Charles was being helpful, which he shouldn't have. It should have been a ground crew, but he was being helpful, taking the photo box out of the camera, and it opened up on him and spoiled the photos. So he had to go tell the Major, and the Major hit the roof, and didn't I get it? My hour of glory was indeed short. And I have this certificate, and it's his mention in Dispatch, and that's actually signed by Winston Churchill, who was Secretary of State for War. This was issued actually in July 1919, after the war, but it's interesting that it's signed by Winston Churchill. He flew over 40 hours with Newell, but and they also got lost and interrupted a football game in some abandoned airfield and had adventures in taking off, and they also had an emergency landing when one of the cylinders of the engine blew up when they were flying. But not with Charles. Newell was wounded when an anti-aircraft shell burst near him, and he was hit in the temple, and he lost sense of touch and returned to England. And Charles did hear that he was improving, but never made contact with him again. Captain Bertel was a seasoned pilot actually on his second tour, so he would have been a flight leader. And he was up with a young observer, and they were attacked by 3 Fall Scouts, and the observer was badly wounded. And but Bartel escaped by rolling and looping the big ack, and then they were rescued by 2 Sopwith camels who chased the scouts away, and they were able to land safely, although the observer lost his leg. So when the Sopwith squadron phoned and said they didn't know big acks could loop, and well, then the whole squadron went on an orgy of looping and whatnot, and Charles was up with Bertel, and Bertel was doing a loop, but it didn't make it. And of course, that's another thing. The observer, they were actually issued a piano stool to sit on, but it encumbered them working the gun and the Morris stuff, so they took the piano. So when he went up flying, he stood for the whole 2.5 hours or whatever they were in that back seat. There was no safety belts, and so he had to brace himself, and they lost the flare pistol and other stuff that was not tied down in the cockpit. And this is the Falls B3, another German. That one looks even more modern than the D7, doesn't it? Although I think it was a preset, and this would be a Sopwith camel like yours out here. Or no, yours is a Spad. The SE5.
Newport and SE5.
Yeah, Newport. So a bad day that Charles observed. The first was he observed one of their planes just disintegrating in midair, and it had been shot down by one of its own shells. And I guess it was a new battery crew, and the battery crew were instructed that before they rammed the shell into the artillery piece and pulled the lanyard, they had to look through the barrel, because this airplane was doing this figure-8 pattern over the target and over the battery, and the new crew didn't look through the gun, and the airplane happened to be on the trajectory of the shell, and the shell went right through the airplane. And then a few minutes later, a pilot named Drinkwater, a Padre turned pilot, and one of the best flyers with photos where they had to fly at dead level and put the camera at the right sequence so that they got overlapping pictures to make their mosaics. And they were hit by an anti-aircraft shell, or a burst near them that made them crash. But he said the next morning the squadron was awakened by this enemy aircraft flying overhead, and of course they were shooting at it, but the airplane dropped a message, and it told them that obviously a squadron on the other side of the line had known what squadron these guys were from, and the observer had died, but Drinkwater had survived with a broken leg, and after the war actually met Charles again. So I'm getting near the end. Number 2 squadron, where it was based at 5,000 feet in the air, you could see this Hill 70, which is well known in First World War history, at Vimy and Arras. And to the north, Armentières, and the large city of Lille, which had been in German hands throughout the war. And one morning in late October, one of their observation planes came in saying that the people were celebrating the liberation of Lille, and an observer named French, who was also spoke French and was from Winnipeg, had gone around and collected a whole bunch of Paris newspapers from all the neighborhood, and announcing Woodrow Wilson's 14-point peace plan, and with the compliments of the English aviators, which they wrote on each newspaper. 2 planes, which included Charles, took off and had these tied in 5 paper bundles and dropped them on the crowd celebrating the liberation of Rome. And it was actually, I wasn't able to find it, but something one of my cousins had read, that it was actually written up about these planes dropping these newspapers, both in London and Paris newspapers, a few days afterward. His tour was complete on October 22nd, 1918. He did a last visit to the 113th Casualty Clearing Stations and made a couple of hospital beds with the nurses. And he did a last flight with Pilot Bear, and they were looking for the retreating enemy, and they were weaving so they wouldn't, and making violent turns so they wouldn't be shot down from the ground. And it was the only time that Charles got sick flying, and they didn't locate the retreating enemy. And so in his words, it was only for the few to finish in a blaze of glory. He finished getting sick. So then he returned to England for pilot training. On November the 11th, he met his brother Henry, who had just completed, who hadn't been to the front at all, but had just completed his pilot training and was his squadron was due to go to France on November the 12th, but it was canceled because the war ended. And Charles went to London, was to report to headquarters, and ended up participating in the ceremonies of the celebration of the end of the First World War in Piccadilly Circus. Then he married my grandmother in Reading in November 1930, November 30th, 1918, with his brother as his best man. And that's the third photograph that he was able to bring that, and that's his brother in front of a DH-9. And my grandmother convinced him not to be a pilot and stopped training because she'd known too many killed in training accidents and whatnot. And they came, in April they came across the Atlantic in a ship and then across Canada by train to Hague, BC, and I don't think my Cornwall-raised grandmother ever really forgave my grandfather for bringing her to the wilderness from somewhere. And he worked for the railroad, for both the CPR and the Kettle Valley Railroad across really all of southern BC. And they had 5 kids and 19 grandchildren, which I'm one of them. And these are the 5 kids plus the dog in 1934. The middle boy is my dad, and the tall one, my Uncle Vernon, he actually flew in the Second World War as a navigator and got special permission to wear Papa's observation wing on his tunic. He was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I was telling Doug that it's the first time I've actually seen in person Nansen, and Uncle Vernon flew Anson's bombing Hitler's Sea Lion invasion barges during the Battle of Britain, and was wounded, and then went on later on to fly in Liberators over the Mediterranean, and actually the bomber that he was on actually sunk a German submarine. And then I think he rose quite, I don't have as long as my cousin in England does, but I think he rose quite high in the Canadian Air Force by the end of the war, and then quit and came back and worked in the Bank of Montreal that he left, and then he had married an English girl, and they lived in England, and then during the Suez crisis he actually joined the RAF and went to Egypt for a tour, and then lived the rest of his life in England, and I think he lived till he was 97. My grandmother, There's Charles in 1951. After he retired, he actually worked on construction of the Rogers Pass Highway and a gas main through the Coquihalla, delivering construction because there were no access roads in those days. This had been in the 50s. He would deliver construction crews on the railroad tracks. In Sadie made 3 trips to England by ship, to England and Germany, where another uncle was stationed after the war in the Canadian Army. And they retired, and he passed away at 97 years old. And that's his story.
And now, we do have a little tradition here, this back, yes. A beautifully hand-wrapped bottle of fermented grapefruit.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.